January 17, 1991. The skies over Iraq. Two American F-15 Eagle pilots are about to make history in a way that would change air combat forever. They're flying at nearly the speed of sound, locked in a deadly dance with Iraqi MiG-29s, some of the most advanced fighters the Soviet Union ever built. In the next few minutes, these American pilots will either become legends or statistics. What happened in those moments above the desert would prove once and for all which superpower built the better war machine. This is the story of the greatest jet versus jet showdown of Desert Storm, a battle that rewrote the rules of modern air warfare. The Gulf War didn't start on January 17th. It started months earlier, when Saddam Hussein made a decision that would change the Middle East forever. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces rolled into Kuwait. It was a massive invasion, overwhelming and brutal. Within hours, Kuwait was occupied. The world watched in shock as one sovereign nation simply swallowed another. But Saddam miscalculated. He thought the world would complain but ultimately do nothing. He was wrong. President George H.W. Bush drew a line in the sand. The United Nations gave Saddam a deadline. Get out of Kuwait or face the consequences. Saddam refused. He had the fourth largest army in the world. He had battle-hardened troops fresh from 8 years of war with Iran. He had thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and a formidable air force. Among his prized possessions were the MiG-29s, fighters so advanced that even NATO analysts respected them. Saddam believed his military could withstand anything the Americans threw at him. He was about to learn a very painful lesson. As the deadline approached, the United States and its coalition partners assembled the largest military force since Vietnam. Operation Desert Shield became Operation Desert Storm. The plan was ambitious and unprecedented. The coalition would begin with an air campaign so overwhelming, so technologically superior, that it would cripple Iraq's ability to fight before a single ground troop crossed the border. At the heart of this air campaign were the F-15 Eagles, flown by some of the most skilled pilots in the world. The F-15 Eagle is not just a fighter jet. It's a legend. Developed in the 1970s, it was designed with one purpose: air superiority. The F-15 was built to dominate the skies, to outfly, outfight, and outlast anything the Soviets could throw at it. With a top speed exceeding Mach 2.5, powerful engines, and an unmatched radar system, the Eagle was a predator. Its combat record spoke for itself. Since entering service, the F-15 had never been shot down in air-to-air combat. Not once. Pilots who flew it called it the most capable fighter ever built. Iraqi pilots were about to find out why. The MiG-29, known by its NATO reporting name Fulcrum, was the Soviet Union's answer to American air superiority. It was sleek, fast, and deadly, armed with advanced missiles and a helmet-mounted sight system that allowed pilots to target enemies just by looking at them. The MiG-29 was a formidable opponent. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could challenge any fighter in the world. Saddam Hussein had purchased several of these jets, and his pilots trained extensively with Soviet advisors. On paper, the MiG-29 versus F-15 matchup should have been close. But wars aren't fought on paper. January 17th arrived. At 0238 local time, the air war began. Tomahawk cruise missiles streaked through the night sky. Apache helicopters took out radar installations. Stealth F-117 Nighthawks slipped past Iraqi defenses and dropped precision bombs on command centers. The coalition's plan was working perfectly. But the Iraqi Air Force wasn't going to sit on the ground and wait to be destroyed. They scrambled fighters. Among them were the MiG-29s. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown. Captain Rick Tolini and Captain Larry Pitts were flying their F-15 Charlie models as part of a fighter sweep deep into Iraqi airspace. Their mission was simple: find and destroy any Iraqi aircraft that dared to challenge coalition air superiority. Both men were experienced pilots, calm under pressure, trained for exactly this moment. Their radars were scanning the skies when suddenly, contacts appeared. Multiple bogies, fast movers, heading their direction. The radio crackled with confirmation. MiG-29s. This was it. The fight they'd trained for their entire careers. Tolini's heart rate barely changed. Years of training kicked in. He armed his AIM-7 Sparrow missiles and checked his radar again. The MiGs were closing fast. In air combat, the first shot often decides everything. The F-15's radar gave the Americans a massive advantage. They could see the enemy long before the enemy could see them. Tolini and Pitts locked onto their targets. The rules of engagement were clear. Identify the target. Confirm hostile intent. Fire. Tolini called out the shot. Fox 1. The Sparrow missile dropped from his Eagle and ignited, screaming through the sky at over 3 times the speed of sound. The Iraqi pilots never saw it coming. The first MiG exploded in a fireball. The second pilot tried to evade, throwing his jet into a hard turn, but Pitts was already on him. Another Sparrow launched. Another kill. In less than 90 seconds, 2 of Iraq's most advanced fighters were burning wreckage falling toward the desert below. The American pilots didn't celebrate. There were more contacts on the radar. The fight was far from over. What made the F-15 so dominant wasn't just its weapons or speed. It was the entire system behind it. American pilots trained harder and longer than almost anyone else in the world. They flew hundreds of hours in simulators and real aircraft, practicing every possible scenario. They studied enemy tactics. They knew the capabilities and limitations of both their own jets and their adversaries. When an American pilot climbed into an F-15, he wasn't just a man in a machine. He was part of a weapon system that included satellite intelligence, AWACS early warning aircraft, electronic warfare support, and a logistics network that ensured every jet was maintained to perfection. The Iraqi pilots, in contrast, were brave but outmatched. Many had combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War, but that conflict had been fought with older tactics and older technology. The Iraqis trained with Soviet doctrine, which emphasized ground-controlled interception. Their pilots relied heavily on instructions from ground radar controllers. When the coalition destroyed those radar sites in the opening hours of the war, Iraqi pilots were left flying blind, forced to rely on their own onboard radars, which were inferior to the American systems. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Throughout the first days of Desert Storm, the pattern repeated itself. Iraqi fighters would take off, hoping to defend their airspace. American F-15s would intercept them. The Iraqis would die. The kills stacked up. Captain Steve Tate shot down a MiG-29 on the 19th of January. Captain Rory Drager and Captain Anthony Murphy each downed MiGs in separate engagements. Every encounter ended the same way. The F-15 pilots returned to base. The Iraqi pilots didn't. The scorecard was becoming embarrassingly one-sided. Let's talk about the technology for a moment, because it's crucial to understanding why this wasn't even close to a fair fight. The F-15s and APG-63 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 50 miles. It could guide missiles while still searching for other threats. The AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles gave the Eagle beyond visual range capability. This meant American pilots could shoot down enemies they couldn't even see with their own eyes. The MiG-29 had decent radar, but it was shorter ranged and less reliable. Iraqi pilots often had to get much closer to even know Americans were there. By then it was too late. Communication was another huge advantage. American pilots had secure radios and data links that allowed them to share information instantly. If one pilot saw a threat, every friendly aircraft in the area knew about it within seconds. AWACS aircraft orbiting safely behind the front lines could see everything happening across hundreds of miles and direct fighters to intercepts. The Iraqis had nothing comparable. Their communication systems were primitive by comparison, and many had been destroyed in the opening attacks. Iraqi pilots were isolated, confused, and overwhelmed. Then there was training. American F-15 pilots went through some of the most rigorous training programs in the world. Red flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada pitted them against aggressor squadrons that flew like Soviet pilots and used Soviet tactics. They learned to fight outnumbered. They learned to manage complex multi-aircraft engagements. They learned how to stay calm when missiles were flying and radars were screaming warnings. Iraqi pilots had training too, but it was nowhere near this level of intensity or realism. When the real shooting started, the difference showed immediately. By the end of January, the Iraqi Air Force was in shambles. Dozens of aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Others had been shot down in one-sided air battles. Saddam Hussein made a desperate decision. He ordered his remaining fighter jets to fly to Iran, Iraq's former enemy, hoping to preserve them for future use. Over 100 Iraqi aircraft fled across the border. Iran impounded them all and never gave them back. It was a humiliating end for an air force that had once been considered formidable. The skies over Iraq now belonged entirely to the coalition. The air superiority established by the F-15 Eagles enabled everything else that followed. With Iraqi fighters swept from the sky, coalition aircraft could attack ground targets with impunity. A-10 Warthogs shredded Iraqi tanks. F-16 Fighting Falcons bombed supply depots. B-52 Stratofortresses carpet-bombed Iraqi positions. Apache helicopters hunted down Scud missile launchers. The Iraqi army, dug into positions in Kuwait, was pounded relentlessly from the air for weeks. When the ground war finally began on February 24th, Iraqi resistance crumbled within 100 hours. Let's focus on one more specific engagement because it perfectly illustrates the disparity. On January 26th, Captain David Rose and his wingmen were flying a combat air patrol when they encountered a pair of MiG-29s, older but still dangerous Iraqi fighters. Rose locked onto the first MiG and fired. The missile tracked perfectly and destroyed the target. The second MiG pilot panicked and ejected before Rose even had a chance to shoot at him. He abandoned a perfectly functioning airplane because he knew he had no chance. That's how terrified Iraqi pilots had become. They'd rather parachute into the desert than face an F-15. The psychological impact of the F-15's dominance cannot be overstated. Iraqi pilots knew that taking off was essentially a suicide mission. Morale collapsed. Maintenance crews stopped repairing damaged aircraft. Senior officers fled. The entire Iraqi Air Force essentially gave up. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete psychological breakdown caused by facing an enemy so superior that resistance seemed pointless. The F-15 had achieved what military theorists call escalation dominance, the ability to win at every level of conflict so decisively that the enemy stops trying. Why was the F-15 so successful? It comes down to a combination of factors that work together as a system. First, superior technology. The radar, the missiles, the flight control systems, all were a generation ahead of anything Iraq possessed. Second, superior training. American pilots were simply better prepared for modern air combat. Third, superior tactics. The U.S. Air Force had studied air warfare intensely since Vietnam and developed tactics specifically designed to maximize the F-15's advantages. Fourth, superior support. American pilots had AWACS, tankers, electronic warfare aircraft, and intelligence support that Iraqi pilots could only dream of. But there's something else worth mentioning. The F-15 was designed by people who understood that air combat had changed. In World War II in Korea, fighters got close and engaged in turning dogfights. By Vietnam, missiles were supposed to make dogfighting obsolete, but the early missiles were unreliable. The F-15's designers learned from these lessons. They built a jet that could dogfight if necessary, with excellent maneuverability and a powerful cannon, but that could also kill enemies from miles away with reliable missiles. It was the perfect fighter for the modern era. The Iraqi MiG-29 pilots weren't cowards. They were professionals facing impossible odds. Some of them tried to fight, some tried to run, some ejected rather than face certain death. You can't blame them. Imagine being told to fly into combat knowing that your enemy can see you before you can see them, can shoot you before you're in range to shoot back, and has backups and support you can't match. It's not a battle. It's an execution. The bravest thing some of those Iraqi pilots did was climb into their cockpits at all, knowing they probably wouldn't come back. Let's put some numbers on this dominance. During Desert Storm, coalition forces flew over 100,000 sorties. The F-15 Eagles accounted for 34 of the 37 aerial victories achieved by U.S. Air Force fighters. 34 confirmed kills. 0 losses in air-to-air combat. That's not just impressive. That's historically unprecedented. No other fighter in history has achieved that level of dominance in a major conflict. The F-15's perfect record, which started in Israeli service in the 1970s, continued unblemished through Desert Storm and remains unbroken to this day. The lessons learned from these engagements influenced air combat doctrine for decades. Modern air forces around the world studied what happened over Iraq and drew the obvious conclusions. Technology matters. Training matters. Integration with support systems matters. You can't just buy advanced jets and expect to compete with a well-trained, well-supported force flying slightly less advanced jets. The whole system has to work together. Countries that tried to shortcut this lesson by purchasing advanced Russian or Chinese fighters without investing in training and support found themselves just as vulnerable as Iraq had been. After the war, analysis of the F-15 versus MiG-29 engagements revealed something interesting. In simulator battles conducted after Desert Storm, When American pilots flew against experienced pilots in MiG-29s under controlled conditions, the fights were much closer. The MiG-29 was actually a capable aircraft, but in the chaos of real combat, with all the other factors in play, the American advantages were simply overwhelming. This taught military planners that platform capability is only part of the equation. Everything else matters just as much. The F-15 Eagles that dominated the skies over Iraq in 1991 are still flying today, more than 30 years later. They've been upgraded with better radars, better missiles, better computers, but the basic airframe is the same design from the 1970s. That's a testament to how well the original designers understood what makes a great fighter. Some F-15E Strike Eagles, a variant designed for ground attack, are expected to remain in service until 2040 or beyond. Very few military aircraft have such longevity. It speaks to the fundamental soundness of the design. The pilots who flew those missions over Iraq came home as heroes, but most of them were humble about their achievements. They knew they'd had every advantage. They'd been flying superior aircraft with superior support against an outmatched enemy. That doesn't diminish their skill or bravery. They still had to execute under pressure. They still had to make the right decisions in seconds. They still had to put their lives on the line. But they recognized that they'd been set up for success by a military system that invested heavily in giving them every possible edge. Iraq's defeat in Desert Storm had consequences that echoed for decades. Saddam Hussein survived, but his military was shattered. International sanctions crippled Iraq's economy. The no-fly zones enforced by coalition aircraft for over a decade prevented Iraq from rebuilding its air force. When the United States invaded again in 2003, Iraqi air defenses barely even tried to resist. The lesson of 1991 had been learned. Fighting American air power was futile. This time, the Iraqi Air Force mostly didn't even take off. Pilots buried their jets in the sand or fled. The humiliation of Desert Storm was complete. For the United States military, Desert Storm validated decades of investment in technology and training. The hollow force that struggled in Vietnam had been completely rebuilt. The all-volunteer military, professional and well-equipped, had proven itself against a substantial opponent. The doctrine of achieving air superiority first, then using that advantage to enable everything else, became enshrined as standard practice. Every American military operation since Desert Storm has begun the same way. Establish control of the skies, then proceed with the rest of the mission. The F-15 versus MiG-29 battles also influenced aircraft sales worldwide. Countries looking to modernize their air forces saw what happened and drew conclusions. Some decided to buy American. Others decided to buy Russian or European, but invested heavily in training and support systems. A few countries decided that competing in traditional air combat was hopeless and focused on asymmetric strategies like surface-to-air missiles and cyber warfare. The market for fighter jets became more competitive, with manufacturers highlighting not just aircraft performance but total system capability. One of the most dramatic moments came when Captain Rick Tolini, who scored the first F-15 kill of the war, described his feelings after the engagement. He said it was surreal. Years of training compressed into 90 seconds of actual combat. The Iraqi pilot never had a chance to react. The missile hit before the MiG pilot probably even knew he was being targeted. Tolini felt professional satisfaction at executing his mission perfectly, but also a strange emptiness. It was over so fast. All that preparation for such a brief moment. Other pilots described similar feelings. The actual combat was almost anticlimactic given how one-sided it was. The ground crews deserve recognition too. Maintaining an F-15 is incredibly complex. These jets require hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. During Desert Storm, maintainers worked around the clock in brutal desert conditions to keep the Eagles flying. They dealt with sand that got into everything, extreme temperature swings, and the pressure of knowing that any mistake could cost a pilot's life. The fact that F-15s maintained such high readiness rates throughout the campaign is a testament to the skill and dedication of these often overlooked professionals. Intelligence played a crucial role as well. Before the war even started, American intelligence agencies had detailed information about Iraqi air defenses, aircraft locations, and pilot training levels. This information was constantly updated and fed to mission planners and pilots. When an F-15 pilot took off, he knew where Iraqi fighters were based, what routes they typically flew, and what tactics they preferred. This intelligence advantage meant American pilots were never surprised. They always knew what they were facing and could plan accordingly. The diplomatic fallout from Iraq's crushing defeat was significant. Arab nations that had supported Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War now distanced themselves. The myth of Arab military strength, already damaged by repeated defeats against Israel, was shattered completely. It became clear that without access to Western technology and training, Arab air forces couldn't compete with modern opponents. This realization drove some countries toward military reform and others toward unconventional warfare strategies that avoided direct military confrontation. Let's talk about what might have been different if Iraq had been better prepared. Suppose Iraqi pilots had trained to Western standards. Suppose they had better intelligence and communication systems. Suppose their ground-based air defense network hadn't been destroyed in the opening hours. Would the MiG-29 have performed better? Almost certainly. The jet itself was capable. But changing those factors would have required Iraq to fundamentally transform its entire military structure, something that would have taken years and enormous resources. Saddam had neither the time nor the inclination to make such changes. The economic cost of the war was staggering for Iraq. Not just the immediate destruction, but the long-term consequences of sanctions and isolation. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies spent billions on the military operation, but recovered economically within a few years. The disparity in economic power between the two sides meant that even if Iraq had somehow won individual battles, it could never have won the overall war. The industrial and technological base that produced the F-15 and trained its pilots was simply too powerful to overcome. Some military historians argue that Desert Storm represented a revolution in military affairs, a fundamental change in how wars are fought. The combination of stealth, precision weapons, satellite intelligence, and network communications created a new form of warfare where a technologically advanced force could achieve victory with minimal casualties. The F-15's dominance was just one part of this larger revolution, but it was a dramatic and visible part that captured public attention and demonstrated the new reality of combat. For the families of the F-15 pilots, the war was a time of intense anxiety, despite the military's overwhelming advantages. Every mission carried risks. Mechanical failures could down a jet. A lucky shot from ground fire could kill a pilot. Even in a one-sided war, there's no such thing as a completely safe combat mission. The families waited and worried and celebrated when their loved ones returned safely. They knew their pilots were skilled and well-equipped, but that didn't make the waiting any easier. The media coverage of Desert Storm brought these air battles into living rooms around the world. CNN broadcast live footage of the air campaign. Gun camera videos showed missiles striking targets with precision. The American public, which had been deeply skeptical of military adventures after Vietnam, watched in amazement as the military executed a nearly flawless campaign. The F-15's perfect record became a symbol of American military excellence, a source of national pride during a time when the country was still finding its footing after the Cold War. Iraq's decision to invade Kuwait proved to be one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders of the 20th century. Saddam thought he could get away with it. Instead, he provoked a response that destroyed his military, impoverished his country, and ultimately led to his own downfall years later. The F-15 pilots who dominated his air force were just instruments of that larger strategic failure. They did their jobs with skill and professionalism, but the real story is about how a dictator's miscalculation led to complete disaster. As we approach the conclusion, it's worth reflecting on what the F-15 versus MiG-29 battles tell us about modern warfare. They demonstrate that technology alone isn't enough. The MiG-29 was advanced technology, but it didn't matter. They show that training is essential. Iraqi pilots were brave, but unprepared for the reality they faced. They proved that system integration is crucial. The F-15 worked as part of a larger network that multiplied its effectiveness. And they remind us that in war, advantages compound. A small edge in one area combines with edges in other areas to create overwhelming superiority. The legacy of these battles continues today. Modern air forces study the lessons learned over Iraq. Fighter pilots watch gun camera footage from Desert Storm engagements as part of their training. Aircraft designers consider the factors that made the F-15 so successful when developing new fighters. The echoes of those encounters above the desert in 1991 still resonate in military planning rooms around the world. The ultimate jet versus jet showdown of Desert Storm wasn't just a historical event. It was a defining moment that shaped how nations think about air power. So what happened in the skies over Iraq during Desert Storm? American F-15 Eagle pilots achieved complete air superiority against an opponent that should have been capable of putting up more of a fight. They did it through a combination of superior technology, superior training, superior tactics, and superior support systems. The Iraqi MiG-29 pilots, despite flying capable aircraft, never had a realistic chance. The battles were short, one-sided, and decisive. 34 kills, 0 losses. It was the most dominant display of air combat capability in modern history, a testament to what happens when a military system fires on all cylinders. The pilots who flew those missions are older now. Some have retired, some have passed away, but their achievement remains. They proved that the billions of dollars spent developing the F-15, the countless hours spent training, the complex support systems built to sustain air operations, all of it was worth it. When the moment came, when American pilots faced enemy fighters in actual combat, the system worked exactly as designed. The Eagles dominated, the enemy fell, and the legend of the F-15 grew even stronger. That's the story of Desert Storm's ultimate jet versus jet showdown, a story of technology, training, and total air superiority.